Can't give up my stuff. Nonviolent organizations and armed resistance. In 1961, activists of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, were the first organizers to advance the philosophy of nonviolence and to practice nonviolent direct action in Mississippi. Medgar Evers never publicly disavowed nonviolence. On the other hand, he would privately express his disagreement with the philosophy of nonviolence to SNCC organizers. SNCC activist MacArthur Cotton often traveled with Medgar in the early 1960s. Reflecting on his travels with Evers around the state, Cotton commented, "Medgar used to carry a gun. He always talked about how crazy we was talking about nonviolence." The NAACP never overtly promoted armed resistance. The organization's national leadership also never advocated nonviolent direct action as a primary method of struggle. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which began organizing in Mississippi in 1961, became the first activist organization to advocate nonviolence as a philosophy, strategy, or tactical approach in the Mississippi Black freedom struggle. Within 2 years, another nonviolent activist group, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, also became active in the state. A natural tension developed when nonviolent activists began to organize in communities where indigenous leadership and sympathizers believed in and practiced armed self-defense on a normal basis. The interaction between nonviolent and armed activists would be at times tense and in other instances complementary. The successful Montgomery bus boycott, December 1st, 1955 to December 20th, 1956, and the dynamic sit-in campaigns of 1960 propelled nonviolent direct action as a primary tactic in the struggle to dismantle U.S. apartheid. The philosophy of nonviolence ascended as the preeminent orientation of the organized movement, particularly on the national level. Indigenous activists and local people tended to continue the practice of armed self-defense as the struggle advanced in Mississippi and other southern communities. Origins of nonviolence and the Black freedom struggle. In the 1960s, nonviolence had recently emerged as an orientation, strategy, and practice. CORE was the first national organization to advocate and practice nonviolence as a primary philosophy and strategy in the Black liberation movement. CORE's origins emanate from the legacy of U.S. pacifist activism. In 1941, the Christian pacifist organization Fellowship of Reconciliation, FOR, which began as a pacifist group during World War I, developed a special project at the University of Chicago aimed at challenging racism. Activists' confrontation without the use of violent force was the exclusive tactic of CORE. The organization's statement of purpose read, "CORE has one method, interracial, nonviolent, direct action." By December 1942, CORE grew from a campus-based peace team at the University of Chicago to a small federation of local direct action groups committed to nonviolence. In 1943, the Federation officially named itself the Congress of Racial Equality. The Montgomery bus boycott captured the attention and imagination of the Black freedom struggle. The momentum of the Montgomery bus boycott yielded another important player in the nonviolent movement in 1957. On January 10th and 11th, the first meeting of the Southern Leadership Conference, SLC, took place at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. The purpose of this meeting was to create a regional organization of local church-based desegregation movements, which had emerged in several southern urban centers. The purpose of this meeting was to create a regional organization of local church-based desegregation movements, which had emerged in several southern urban centers. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the popular leader of this new organization. The leadership of SLC emphasized the philosophy of nonviolent direct action as the central weapon necessary to desegregate institutions in the South. In their initial statement to the press, the SLC expressed the following message to the Black community to discourage any use of force in the freedom movement. We call upon them to accept Christian love in its full power to defy. Nonviolence is not a symbol of weakness or cowardice, but as Jesus and Gandhi demonstrated, resistance transforms weakness into strength and breeds courage in the face of danger. While calling for Black people to confront segregation, even in the face of death, the SLC declared, "Not one hair of one head of one white person shall be harmed." Soon after its founding, the SLC announced that it would be identified as the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC. The predominance of clerical leadership in its membership and the sensitivity of being labeled communist motivated the addition of Christian to the organization's name. SCLC's approach was to utilize confrontational but nonviolent tactics in campaigns to oppose segregation in local communities. The goal of SCLC's Nonviolent Direct Action campaign was to create a local crisis that could draw the attention of the national media and the executive and legislative branches of the federal government and sway U.S. public opinion on the side of the Black freedom struggle. In order to win the public opinion fight with white segregationists, and particularly to gain the support of white liberals, SCLC leaders felt it necessary to disassociate themselves from any act of retaliatory violence or form of armed self-defense by local Black activists or supporters of the struggle. In this sense, nonviolence was an important ideological weapon in SCLC's strategy. SCLC leaders believed that the use of force by Black people would only serve to alienate white liberals and the general white U.S. public. The February 1st, 1960 sit-in at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, led to an explosion of nonviolent demonstrations by student activists throughout the South. This student-initiated movement was pivotal in the creation of SNCC. Ella Baker, then the executive director of SCLC, convened a conference on April 16th through 18th, 1960, at Shaw College in Raleigh, North Carolina. The purpose of this conference was to coordinate the activities of various student groups that had blossomed throughout the South after the Greensboro sit-in. The Raleigh Conference would become the founding convention of SNCC. SCLC, CORE, and FOR were all represented at the Raleigh Conference. Martin Luther King Jr., by this time a nationally recognized leader of the civil rights movement, addressed the conference. But a lesser-known activist would have a greater philosophical influence on the direction of the new organization. James Lawson, a committed Gandhian and nonviolent activist, made convincing arguments for protest based on moral and spiritual foundations. Lawson, a theology student and Southern Field Secretary for FOR, had a rich history of pacifist activism. As a missionary in India, he studied Mahatma Gandhi's method of nonviolent activism. As an activist, Lawson involved himself with the Nashville student movement's effort to desegregate lunch counters in the spring of 1960. Lawson's influence was critical to the adoption of a nonviolent philosophy based on Christian principles. Philosophical commitment to nonviolence was reflected in SNCC's statement of purpose. However, in the early years within the organization, this perspective competed for ideological hegemony with the points of view of activists who saw nonviolence as a political tactic. The leadership of the Nashville student movement advocated philosophical nonviolence as a way of life. This group included SNCC founders James Lawson, John Lewis, Diane Nash, and James Bevel. The Nashville group favored confrontational, nonviolent action along the line of the sit-ins to disrupt the institutions of segregation. They believed that nonviolence based upon Gandhian and Christian principles would be a powerful moral force to defeat racist violence and attitudes. The competing point of view saw organizing around voting rights, not direct action in public institutions, as the primary focus of SNCC's activism. This point of view was articulated in SNCC's early years by activists Chuck McDew, Tim Jenkins, Charles Jones, and later on Bob Moses. This group believed that SNCC's priority should be the massive registration of black voters in southern states in which the voting rights of African descendants were denied. This group viewed nonviolence as a tactical weapon to be used by organizers for protection. These activists, similar to the leadership of SCLC, believed that the perception of armed black organizers would not encourage federal intervention or garner support from white liberals for the civil rights movement. In SNCC's early years, no debate took place within the national leadership over embracing nonviolence. While it is possible that some SNCC workers carried weapons in the early years of the organization, armed self-defense was not overtly advocated. In local chapters, some young activists were indifferent to nonviolence. Others openly challenged the concept as a strategy and philosophy. In Nashville, where philosophical nonviolence was reputed to be the most entrenched, student activists debased the method of nonviolence versus self-defense. The Young Turks of the Nashville student movement protected nonviolent demonstrators from white attackers in the city. On a few occasions in the early years, some SNCC workers were armed or advocated use of force for self-defense. Some SNCC and CORE activists also came in contact with local movement activists or supporters who participated in armed self-defense. Most practiced some form of self-defense covertly. The only exception was Robert Williams in Monroe, North Carolina. Under Williams' leadership, Monroe blacks organized armed patrols that had discouraged Klan caravans from harassing and terrorizing their community. Williams' meeting violence with violence statement received national headlines. He was considered the primary advocate for armed self-defense by movement activists and observers. Williams published a newsletter, The Crusader, with national distribution for the purpose of spreading his views on the movement, including his views about armed self-defense. While from exile in Cuba, Williams also produced a radio program, Radio Free Dixie. Williams' open advocacy of armed resistance was an exception in the Southern Black freedom movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Most SNCC and CORE activists came into contact with activists and movement supporters who practiced armed self-defense without seeking or receiving publicity. Michael Flug, a CORE worker from Brooklyn, New York, remembered armed sentries protecting CORE freedom houses throughout the South from 1962 through 1964. The freedom houses were the center of activity, particularly voter registration, and the residences of some field workers and staff in southern communities. Mostly local people would be involved in the sentries, with occasional participation with some CORE workers. While CORE members were bound to practice nonviolence by CORE's rules of action, local people were not obliged to be pacifists. Flug remembered that local black Southerners would be shown passage in CORE's rules of action and comment. I didn't see that. Flug also recalled that those who were willing to provide security for him and other CORE workers were not interested in publicly advocating armed self-defense. In response to Williams' public advocacy of armed resistance, the covert protectors of Freedom House and CORE staff asked, "Why would you want to put that out in the public?" Consistent with the public relations strategy of nonviolent leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., some armed participants in the movement agreed to decrease the visibility of blacks with guns to win support of the federal government and white liberals. Flug argued, "We're playing to the media. Tactically, it wasn't a good idea to advocate or project an armed presence." SNCC activists also received covert armed support in black Southern communities. For instance, SNCC workers were protected by black snipers in a section of the black community of Danville, Virginia in 1963. White supremacist civilians and police would not follow SNCC activists into the black neighborhood for fear of engaging the snipers. While the SNCC statement of purpose committed them to the practice of nonviolence, SNCC organizers appreciated and often depended on the blanket of protection they received from local people in Danville and other places in the South, particularly in Mississippi. The genesis of SNCC in Mississippi and armed self-defense. In the summer of 1960, SNCC volunteer and Harvard doctoral student Bob Moses was sent on a tour of the South to identify areas where the young organization could expand its work. Moses had taken time from his studies to make a contribution to the human rights movement in the South. Mississippi was not represented in the gathering of Southern black college students who came together to form SNCC in April of 1960. And Moses volunteered for the assignment of organizational reconnaissance in Mississippi. He was sent on this mission in August of 1960. SNCC advisor Ella Baker possessed a wealth of experience and contacts from her work with the NAACP, the SCLC, and the leftist Southern Conference Educational Fund. Baker provided Moses with a list of contacts that could provide room, board, and information. The most valuable contact that Baker gave Moses was RCNL and NAACP organizer Amesy Moore. Moore owned a gas station and resided in the Delta town of Cleveland. He was a World War II veteran who organized RCNL voter registration and Don't Buy Gas Where You Can't Use the Restroom efforts. He assisted Ruby Hurley and Medgar Evers in the investigation of the Till murder. See Chapter 2. Moore had survived the financial harassment of the White Citizens Council, in which local white financial institutions refused to extend credit to his business and his hours at his post office job were cut. The National NAACP, the American Friends Service Committee, as well as Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker's New York-based In Friendship Network, provided financial assistance to Moore. Moore's posture towards armed protection was similar to that of his comrades T.R.M. Howard and Medgar Evers. In addition to economic pressure, Moore was the target of threats of violence. The Delta activist was often armed and believed that self-defense was a necessary posture for activists to take for organizing and surviving in Mississippi. Historian Charles Payne described Moore's home as well armed and said that at night, the area around his home may have been the best lit spot in Cleveland. 3 years after Moses' initial Mississippi trip, guests of Moore's home would be offered a loaded Luger handgun by the movement veteran. Artist and writer Tracy Sugarman recalled Moore placing the handgun on the nightstand, stating, "This is in case of emergency." When Sugarman and another guest declined, Moore picked up the weapon and courteously replied, "Just as you say, good night." Moore would provide security for SNCC activists. SNCC organizer Lawrence Guyot remembered, whenever anyone was threatened, Amesy Moore was sort of an individual protection agency. Moses resided with Moore during his 1960 Mississippi trip. Along with Baker's perspectives on developing indigenous leadership and grassroots organizing, Moses' discussions with Moore provided the basic orientation of SNCC organizing in Mississippi. Moore was fed up with the litigation-based campaigns of the NAACP. He also believed that nonviolent activism directed at segregated public facilities would not be effective in Mississippi. Moore argued that a massive voter registration campaign challenging Mississippi black disenfranchisement was the best vehicle to crush white supremacy and ensure African American civil and human rights. Moses developed Moore's views into a proposal for SNCC activists to come to Mississippi to assist indigenous leadership and cultivate new leaders for a massive voter registration project in the state. Moore was invited to a SNCC leadership conference later that year to discuss the idea of a statewide voter registration campaign. The next summer, Moses returned to Cleveland to report to Moore and begin organizing in Mississippi. Moore's contacts throughout the state would become invaluable to SNCC. Agitation of and confrontation with apartheid institutions through nonviolent direct action would not be the primary activity of SNCC in Mississippi. Nonviolence would be an important part of the orientation and practice of Moses in his organizing in the state. Moses was aligned with the voter registration group within SNCC that believed nonviolent direct action to desegregate public facilities should be de-emphasized in favor of organizing black citizens to challenge racist voting restrictions. Moses believed nonviolence was a tool that could allow organizers to assume an offensive posture. He believed that if SNCC organizers commonly carried weapons, they would be constantly stopped by law enforcement and indicted with weapons charges. Moses also did not believe that SNCC organizers had the authority to demand that local black Mississippians disarm and adopt nonviolent tactics. While Moses embraced nonviolence, he believed that greatly organizing disenfranchised blacks to register to vote was the major method by which to involve Mississippians in the movement, not confrontational direct action. The internal debate within the SNCC over whether the emphasis should be nonviolent direct action or voter registration led to a compromise that allowed those committed to civil disobedience to organize projects in Mississippi. The voter registration faction's strategy relied on the perceived commitment of federal intervention, particularly through the Department of Justice, to prevent potential white supremacist violence or to punish the perpetrators of racist violence. In the summer and fall of 1961, SNCC leaders, including Tim Jenkins and Lonnie King, and other movement activists, were involved in a series of meetings with federal officials, including Assistant Attorney General Burke Marshall and Harris Wofford, Special Assistant to President Kennedy on Civil Rights, as well as representatives from liberal foundations. The purpose of these meetings was to develop an apparatus to accelerate black voter registration in the South. The Kennedy administration preferred voter registration efforts to confrontational, nonviolent direct action. The federal executive branch hoped that diverting the activity of the black freedom struggle from nonviolent confrontation to voter registration would reduce the agitation of Southern white supremacists while winning the support of newly registered blacks for the Democratic Party. Nonviolent confrontation was often disruptive and led to open violent reaction from white racists. Federal officials wished to avoid civil disobedience and white reaction, both of which challenged civic order. The ultimate result of these meetings was the formation of the Voter Education Project, VEP, which was administered by the Southern Regional Council, SRC, and funded by the liberal Taconic, Field, and Stern Family Foundations. Not only were SNCC workers and other movement activists to receive financial support through the VEP, but they also believed, as a result of statements made by federal officials, that federal law enforcement would provide protection for voter rights workers in the South. Federal officials later denied making this commitment. Southwest Mississippi became the region where Moses would first initiate a voter registration project in the state. Southwest Mississippi was selected on the basis of Amesy Moore's recommendation. Moore assessed that movement forces in the Delta did not yet possess the resources to provide the necessary support for a sustained voter registration effort. Agreeing with Moore's assessment, Southwest Mississippi NAACP leaders Claude Bryant and E.W. Steptoe requested a SNCC project in that part of the state. The Southwest Mississippi black community of Macomb possessed a network of indigenous leaders with sufficient resources to support the SNCC voter registration project. Macomb was located in Pike County, midway between the Mississippi state capital of Jackson and New Orleans. Due to its location, the town was founded as a railroad nexus to serve the Illinois Central Railroad. The railroad provided blacks with stable union employment. The protection of the union and a small core of black businesses based in the segregated economy allowed the Macomb movement spaces for organizing, which did not exist in the Delta. Macomb had 6,936 blacks of voting age, with only 250 blacks actually registered to vote in 1961. Moses and SNCC were convinced that the local NAACP possessed the necessary resources to initiate a voter registration campaign in Macomb. Pike County NAACP President C.C. Bryant formally invited Moses and solicited local clergy and entrepreneurs for resources to support staff for a voter registration campaign. Two other SNCC workers, Reginald Robinson and John Hardy, joined Moses within weeks of his arrival there. A voter registration class was established at the local Masonic temple. The course attracted blacks not only from Macomb and other parts of Pike County, but also from neighboring counties, Amite and Waltham. A contingent of SNCC workers, including John Hardy and recent recruits, MacArthur Cotton, Jimmy Travis, and George Lowe, were assigned to set up voter registration classes in Walthall. There was not one registered black citizen out of a population of 2,490 voting-aged blacks in Walthall in 1961. MacArthur Cotton had been recruited by Moses in the summer of 1961. Cotton, a native of Attala County, had just finished his freshman year at Tugela College, near Jackson. Cotton and other SNCC workers came to the Walthall municipality of Tylertown in 1961. Local people told Cotton and his comrades about some of the older brothers who prevented night riders from terrorizing a black community outside of Tylertown city limits. Several months prior to SNCC coming to Tylertown, night riders had repeatedly come across the bridge to Maggie's Creek, which separated this black community from predominantly white neighborhoods of the city. To no avail, members of the black community warned that the terrorism must stop. Local blacks told Cotton that during a raid by night riders, a group of brothers with ancient connections captured a white supremacist marauder. Ancient connections suggested that the black captors were a part of a fraternal order. The night rider's head was severed from his body and placed on the bridge as a warning to white terrorists. After this act of counter-terrorism, no white person crossed the Maggie's Creek Bridge unless on business and treated black people in a respectful manner. This Walthall County black enclave served as a haven for SNCC workers. As in the black neighborhood in Danville, Virginia, which was protected by snipers, nonviolent activists could receive protection and refuge. The identification of haven communities for protection throughout the state was essentially to SNCC's work in the state. E. W. Steptoe, a fearless warrior. To the west of Pike County was the black majority Amite County. Amite was considered a bastion of racial violence. Black political representation and land ownership emerged in the county during Reconstruction. But white terror was successful in eliminating the emerging black presence in the county government and in driving the majority of black landowners to agrarian peonage, or to flight away from Amite to what was perceived as greener pastures. Some black farmers fought to maintain their land and stayed in the county. Eldridge Willie Steptoe, known as E.W. Steptoe, descended from the black landowners who endured a racially hostile environment. Bob Moses personally traveled to Amite to organize voter registration efforts. 53-year-old dairy and cotton farmer E.W. Steptoe was president of the county's chapter of NAACP. Steptoe's 240-acre farm overlooked the Mississippi-Louisiana border. He descended from a lineage of independent farmers and entrepreneurs who were respected by Amite blacks and whites alike. Steptoe often traveled across the Louisiana state line for financial survival, as doing so allowed the crafty Amite farmer to outmaneuver the economic pressure of the Mississippi Citizens Council. The Steptoe farm served as housing for SNCC organizers and was often used for meetings and voter registration classes. The youthful SNCC workers admired and respected Steptoe. While small in physical size, Steptoe was revered for his courage and determination. One SNCC activist remembered Steptoe as a fearless warrior. Just being around him inspired you. In describing Steptoe, writer Jack Newfield stated, "His courage, his common sense wisdom, his bittersweet wit and love are the special qualities of the rural Mississippi Negro, who lived by his wits to survive." Newfield also described Steptoe as a violent man. Movement people knew Steptoe to be well armed in order to protect his household, associates, and himself from the violence of white racists. SNCC activist Chuck McDew remembers, "You go to Steptoe's door, and Steptoe just had guns aplenty. As you went to bed, he would open up the night table, and there would be a large .45 automatic sitting next to you. Just guns all over the house, under pillows, under chairs. It was just marvelous." One journalist noted 3 rifles and a .45 caliber pistol at the Steptoe home to ward off night attacks. Steptoe was also generally armed when away from home. SNCC workers would joke about him carrying a small Derringer handgun and about how Steptoe's wife would search him before he went downtown to attempt to register to vote. On different occasions, Steptoe was known to hide handguns in hats he wore, in his sock, or in the crotch of his pants. When Steptoe traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with federal officials, SNCC workers had to convince him not to go to the meeting armed, but to leave his weapon in his hotel room. Chuck McDew commented that the Mississippi farmer came to Washington armed like Pancho Villa. In 1961, Moses was beaten in the Amite County seat, ironically named Liberty, after attempting to take a group of local blacks to register. Moses returned to the Steptoe farm bloody and injured. An angered Steptoe had to be restrained from shooting up the town. Steptoe's son, E.W. Jr., reflecting on his father's belief in retaliatory violence, stated, "He didn't believe in nonviolence. He didn't believe in seeing people get beat up and not doing anything about it. He didn't let anybody push him around." Many SNCC workers depended upon the protection of and were inspired by black farmers like Steptoe. On the other hand, Moses was uncomfortable around Steptoe's guns and his willingness to use them. On the other hand, Moses was uncomfortable. McDew commented, "Bob Moses was always very, very, very nonviolent and would not touch a gun. But there were some others of us who felt very comfortable staying at Steptoe's. On one occasion, Moses noticed that Steptoe was armed when they were entering the elder's vehicle. Moses protested Steptoe being armed and stated, "No, I'm not going. I'm not going with you if you're going to carry a gun." Steptoe replied, "You don't know these people around here." Grudgingly, Steptoe took the gun back to his house. Steptoe was often deceptive about being armed. Moses offered, "I asked Mr. E.W. Steptoe to not carry guns when we got together at night. So instead, he just hid his guns, and then I find out later." On the way to the airport for the previously mentioned trip to Washington, D.C., Moses was said to have told the rural NAACP activist, "Mr. Steptoe, you have a gun. You can't carry guns on the airplane." In response to Moses' request, Steptoe surrendered his weapon. However, Steptoe again fooled his young comrades. McDougall commented, "When we got to Washington, we discovered he had 2 or 3 others on him." Moses ultimately learned not to debate with the elder activists about the virtues or tactical advantages of nonviolence. Neither did the perceptive Mississippian debate the necessity of armed resistance with Moses and other young activists committed to nonviolence. Each seemed to silently acknowledge each other's approach. Moses' experiences with Steptoe prepared him for future encounters with black Mississippians and their attitudes about guns and armed self-defense. While Moses would insist that SNCC workers maintain a nonviolent and unarmed posture, he would not attempt to commit local blacks to nonviolence. Moses argued, "Self-defense is so deeply ingrained in rural Southern America that we as a small group can't affect it." The young activist would articulate, "The difference is that we, on SNCC staff, have committed ourselves to not carry guns." Steptoe's precautions were based on real, not imaginary threats. As was experienced by Moses, it was common that blacks could be randomly beaten in downtown Liberty. While Amite had a majority black population, it only had 1 registered black voter, who never voted, out of a total of 3,560 voting-age blacks in 1960. Steptoe had first attempted to register in Amite in 1953, with subsequent attempts in 1954, 1956, and 1957. Steptoe also initiated the Amite County NAACP in 1954. Local law enforcement and other white supremacists disrupted an NAACP meeting advocating black voter registration. Sheriff E.L. Caston and his deputies, Klans members, as well as other white civilians, raided an NAACP meeting at Mount Pilgrim's Baptist Church and seized the local membership rolls. The Amite NAACP membership totaled nearly 200 at the time. Only after FBI intervention were the membership rolls returned. The white terrorist raid on the Amite NAACP and subsequent intimidation and harassment of individuals on the membership list was effective. Fearing reprisal from white supremacists after the attack on the church, Steptoe's uncle fled to the woods for a week, surviving on raw food. Like many Amite blacks after Reconstruction, he left the county in fear of economic harassment, bodily harm, or death. Only the determined persistence of Steptoe prevented the chapter from completely folding after the repression of county white supremacist forces. On September 24, 1960, Steptoe informed John Doerr of the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Department of Justice that his and other Amite County NAACP leaders' lives were in danger. Doerr left Mississippi for D.C. immediately after his meeting with Steptoe, and the day after his departure, white Mississippi state legislator E.H. Hurst shot and killed a charter member and vice president of the Amite NAACP, Herbert Lee, in downtown Liberty. Lee had transported Moses and Steptoe around the county in their organizing efforts. A coroner's jury ruled that the shooting was self-defense and acquitted Hurst the day after Lee's death. Moses and Steptoe found 3 black witnesses willing to testify that Hurst murdered a defenseless Lee. One of these witnesses, Lewis Allen, had been coerced into corroborating Hurst's claim of self-defense at the coroner's inquest. With the guarantee of protection, Allen informed Moses of his willingness to admit that his previous testimony was coerced and false. Allen would acknowledge to a grand jury that Hurst murdered Lee. Moses appealed to federal officials for Allen to receive protection. Moses was informed by Department of Justice officials there was no way possible to provide security for Allen. Without federal protection, local white supremacists constantly harassed Allen for years. On the eve of planning to leave the state to escape the harassment, Allen was shot in the driveway of his farm on January 31st, 1964. The lack of intervention by federal officials somewhat stymied the voter registration efforts in Amite. Steptoe was quite familiar with Hurst since the white politician lived down the road from his farm. He had witnessed and been involved in disputes with the Hurst family as he grew up. The day prior to Lee's death, Hurst was identified by Steptoe to Doerr as a potential threat. Steptoe continued in his attempt to organize local blacks to challenge Amite's white power structure in spite of Lee's murder and the lack of federal protection for human rights activists. Steptoe and his family recognized the inadequacy of relying on federal protection after the lack of justice in the death of Lee. The male members of the Steptoe family, including himself and his 5 sons, established their own sanctuary around the Steptoe farm. He continued to organize and maintain his relationship with Moses and SNCC. Steptoe remained an inspiration and elder to the young activists.